Hi everyone, my name is Erika, and my study examines how the media portrays social movements involving race by comparing how the news media portrayed the Black Lives Matter protests in response to George Floyd's death and the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. There we go, okay. So according to the founders, the Black Lives Matter movement is an ideological and political intervention in a world where Black lives are systemically and intentionally targeted for demise. The movement has remained strong since its start in 2013, but has recently peaked in response to the death of George Floyd, who was handcuffed and pinned to the ground over an alleged counterfeit bill. Bystanders captured a video of Officer Derek Chauvin on video using his knee to pin Floyd by the neck and eventually suffocate him. The next day, the video spread across social media, becoming the driving force to a wave of protests that in some cases escalated to violence that would continue throughout the summer. On the other side of the political spectrum is the alt-right. Scholars argue over the definition of the alt-right is like that of white supremacy, the belief in the superiority of the white race. On one night in August of 2017, a group of approximately 100 alt-right protesters gathered at the University of Virginia's campus in Charlottesville to protest the removal of a statue of a Confederate monument. A series of brawls erupted between protesters and counter-protesters, and the next day, an even larger group of white supremacists infiltrated the town of Charlottesville for a Unite the Right rally. Violence ensued here too when a 20-year-old white supremacist intentionally drove his car through a crowd of counter-protesters, killing one and injuring 19 more. Because of the vast influential role of the media today, organizers and members of social movements intentionally try and attract the attention of the media through boycotts, rallies, and protests. Organizers hope that coverage will be positive and consistent with the intent of the movement, but this is not always the case. As theorized in the first citation by McLeod, unfavorable media coverage is often likely when concerning controversial topics, as media outlets hold different biases. Moreover, scholars such as Van Geek argue that since racism is so prevalent in American society, any news involving African Americans is likely to create an inaccurate picture of the situation. In this case, journalists and editors act as agents of racialization, using their writing to define reality rather than reflecting and reporting on it, as Drew claims. Hence, the media has played a strong role in not only spreading awareness for racialized social movements today, but also in shaping and defining these movements. Based on these theories, the protest paradigm has become a model commonly used in the news media to frame reports to express disapproval and dissent towards protests. So these are the different elements of the protest paradigm. And first, there's news frames, which are often used to set the tone of the entire article. Some types include riot frames, which typically overemphasize any disorder, danger, or destruction caused by the protesters. Crime story frames, which describe the protest in terms of criminal acts committed by protesters. And carnival frames, which minimize the social issue being protested to highlight the more theatrical aspects of a protest. And then the next category, journalists are often trained to contact governmental agencies and those with advanced training to lend credibility to stories. But the use of these quotes and statements from those in positions of power are often counterproductive to the protest goals, as protests are generally not positioned to dominant power structures. Journalists also use statements of bystanders to generalize about how members of the public view and are reacting to the social issue in protests. Many times, these people are interviewed out of convenience, so they generally have a limited understanding of the movement, leading to a negative or superficial commentary. Next, delegitimization occurs when coverage of the protest fails to adequately explain the goals of the protest and the objectives of protesters, as the protests then become defined solely by the actions of the protesters rather than the social issue prompting the protest. Lastly, traditional journalistic norms often result in episodic coverage, as actions are listed in chronological order without grounding the actions in any contextual information, leading to instances of demonization. So here are my research questions that look at how the Black issues were portrayed in the media and the white issues, and then compares the two. And based on past research, it is hypothesized that the protest paradigm will be used to portray the Black Lives Matter movement in a demonizing and delegitimizing way, but the Unite the Right rally will not be portrayed the same way. Thus, the study will find the American news media is biased against Black Americans on racialized issues. Utilizing the protest paradigm, my study analyzes the racialization of protests in the news media. Using a comparative analysis, 50 articles were randomly selected from the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal using the term Black Lives Matter, George Floyd, and protest. for a 3-week period following the death of George Floyd. Then 50 articles were randomly selected from the same media outlets with the terms Unite the Right in Charlottesville for a 3-week period following the first night of the rally. A content analysis was conducted, and each section of the protest paradigm was analyzed between the two groups of articles. When looking at news frame, language and tone was analyzed to categorize the various frames and frequency of the frames when compared between the two groups. Specific quotes from official sources and bystanders were recorded if they were either about the movement or the actions of protesters to see if they were used to further demonize either movement. To analyze delegitimization, articles were evaluated based on if the author provided any background information about the movement. And lastly, any instances of significant demonization towards either protesters or the movement by the author of the article were also recorded. So for the Black Lives Matter movement, most of the articles analyzed used a riot frame with a heavy focus on the destruction brought by protesters, such as violence toward police, vandalization of businesses, and arson. Numerous articles also continued to refer to protesters explicitly as rioters instead of protesters part of a larger social movement. The rest of the articles followed a criminal frame or a combination of the riot and criminal frame by focusing on the arrests and laws broken by protesters. Here are some of the significant quotes from the articles. As you can see on the bottom left, some articles even included quotes that defended the actions taken by police. Quotes like these further delegitimized the movement by defending the actions of police officers that led to the wrongful death of George Floyd that the movement is protesting. There were not too many instances of negative quotes from bystanders about protesters, aside from comments such as, "They felt the movement feels like it's getting out of hand." Out of the 50 articles analyzed in the Black Lives Matter category, only 2 articles provided background information about the movement's goals. Some of the other articles gave information about Floyd's death and how the movement responded through protests, but adequate background information about why the movement began and its current goals was severely lacking. Demonization within these articles occurred about a third of the time and included a heavy focus on the violence and destruction inflicted by protesters, along with a strong focus on laws broken by protesters without much other information about the movement itself. Occasionally, instances of demonization included negative rhetoric surrounding protesters, such as calling protesters rioters, looters, or arsonists. The preliminary findings demonstrate that the protest paradigm was utilized to demonize and delegitimize the Black Lives Matter movement. So within the Unite the Right category of articles, just over half of the articles followed the riot frame by focusing on the destruction at the hand of protesters. While most articles fell into the riot frame, the rest of the articles did not follow any frame in the protest paradigm. Rather, these articles continued to refer to the event in Charlottesville as solely a rally, referring to the people there as demonstrators, negligent of the violence that occurred at the rally. In numerous articles in the Unite the Right category, officials were cited denouncing the violence that escalated amongst protesters. Bystanders were often quoted to highlight fear amongst the community, with individuals saying that it was probably the scariest thing they've ever seen in their life. Every article except for one in the Unite the Right category provided adequate background information about the reasoning behind the rally in Charlottesville. Moreover, almost every article provided information about the rising tide of white supremacy in America and the goals and politics of the movement. Lastly, there was no occurrence of demonization within any of the articles analyzed in the Unite the Right category. While some articles did include a stronger focus on violence at the hands of protesters, it was never a central part of the article. All in all, the analysis of the Unite the Right articles confirms the hypothesis in the second research question, proving that the issues pertaining to white Americans are not portrayed in the same demonizing and delegitimizing ways as Black American issues. When comparing the results of the Black Lives Matter and the Unite the Right articles, the study confirms the hypothesis for the third research question, proving that the American news media is biased against Black Americans on racialized issues. When looking at the news frames used, the Black Lives Matter articles used a news frame consistent with the protest paradigm all the time, while the Unite the Right 46% of the time did not use a news frame that demonized the movement. Thus, the Black Lives Matter movement articles always used the news frame that demonized the movement, while the Unite the Right articles only used one a little more than half the time. Statistics regarding negative quotes aimed at protesters were relatively similar, but there were more vilifying quotes from official sources within the Black Lives Matter articles. One of the most prevailing differences between the two results is delegitimization of the movements by failing to provide adequate background information about the movement. 96% of the Black Lives Matter articles failed to provide background information about the movement in comparison to 2% of the Unite the Right articles. So Black Lives Matter articles greatly delegitimized the movement, while the Unite the Right articles did not. Lastly, there were only instances of demonization on behalf of the writer in the Black Lives Matter articles and not the Unite the Right articles. So as previously mentioned, the results of the study show that the media outlets and the articles analyzed are biased against Black Americans on racialized issues. For a relatively newer movement like Black Lives Matter, demonizing media coverage is detrimental to the movement, as the public now perceives and associates the movement with violence and destruction, rather than a call to action in response to the widespread systemic racism permeating American society. In the face of rising inequality, racism, hatred, and discrimination, the media's responsibility to accurately report on the Black Lives Matter movement and its goals is more important than ever. Thank you.